My name is Anne Quaranto. I'm a postdoctoral associate and lecturer at Yale University and in the philosophy department at Yale University, and I work on the social and political dimensions of language.
Well, thank you for joining us in the discussion of your paper, Dog Whistles, Covertly Coded Speech and Practices that Enable Them. Could you give us an idea of how you came to this topic and how you developed this thinking around it that turned into the paper?
Yeah, certainly. So this paper was born for me fairly directly out of the 2016 election, and a lot of the discourse leading up to it and during and after the election. In particular, the different conversations that were happening after that election in which people were trying to make sense of how and why the various polling practices sort of hadn't predicted Trump's win, and what was it about Trump in particular that made this win happen and made it so unpredictable and unexpected for a lot of people. And in a lot of that reflection after that election in the first few months of Trump's term in office, a lot of the rhetoric, a lot of the discourse would look back at media portrayals of Trump in the lead up to the election and point out ways that those portrayals had sort of downplayed his viability as a candidate. And they would always sort of point out features of Trump, like as an individual, which either had gone overlooked before and were actually quite important to explaining his victory, or vice versa, sort of the features that people had fixated upon incorrectly because it turned out those were not relevant to a lot of the folks that ended up voting for him. And I found all of those kinds of explanations, which of course were not the only ones, but I found them quite unsatisfying because they still continued to try to make sense of that election solely in terms of Trump the individual, Clinton the individual, and the voters typically also kind of as individuals reacting to the different candidates. And although I'm sure that is part of the explanation, it never felt like it was the full explanation. And for me, this, I think, was related also to my, at the time, thinking more and more carefully about the different kinds of political uses that we put language to, the ways that we use language in order to enact or exploit or maintain or further different kinds of power relationships, relationships of authority or domination, subjugation, oppression. And for those kinds of questions, it seemed that very clear that the only way to make progress on making sense of the political functions of language was not to think at the level of individual speakers, individual hearers, but to think of those bits of speech in the context of other speakers doing similar things, other speakers doing different things, and other speakers doing similar things at different times, right? And I think the two kind of coalesced for me with the same kind of approach, the same priorities in both cases, where it seemed that in the political case, in the case of linguistic theory, both, we would need to zoom out at least at some point in our theorizing to make sense of what agents or speakers do, not as individuals, but as tokens of a type, as kind of playing a certain role that carries across different contexts, even at different times and different places.
Yeah, and I want to explore that performative and performance value in a little bit. But to begin, I always find it helpful in these discussions to define some terms. So if we could define what you mean by dog whistle, coded speech, and then what we're going to talk about mostly is covertly coded speech. So if you could just give us a brief overview of what those three terms mean.
Definitely. So in the paper, I consciously choose not to attempt to define dog whistles, in part because folks do have a lot of different intuitions about what sorts of terms or phrases are and are not dog whistles. And it's not very clear to what extent we'd be better off if we revised our intuitions or if we revised our definitions in line with the intuitions. It seems like we can make some progress in thinking about the phenomena we're curious about without needing to all agree on precisely what dog whistle speech is. So that's why I instead in the paper choose to define this broader category of covertly coded speech. So let me say a bit about that, and then I can come back to where dog whistles fit in that picture. So covertly coded speech is itself a species of an even broader phenomenon of coded speech, where all it takes for some utterance, whether it's a word, phrase, or a longer chunk, a sentence, if I'm going on for minutes, however big the chunk of speech is, all it takes for it to be coded, in my view, is for it to produce what I call differential effects on the audience. And that's just, it's sending different messages to different subsets of the audience. So there's one message that some hearers receive, another message that some hearers receive, and although there may be some overlap between them, if it's coded speech, there are at least some audience members and some hearers that are left out of the loop, as it were. So lots of our very innocuous, ordinary, everyday speech is coded for various kinds of reasons. A lot of times when I bring up the word coded or code, we immediately think of like Cold War era spies writing things in code. And those sorts of spy codes are certainly a coded speech, insofar as only the people that know how to decipher the code receive a certain message. But there are lots of other, again, quite innocuous uses of language which end up being coded speech. Any sort of jargon, technical jargon, is going to be coded speech. Whether the jargon is using a word that is also in current ordinary English usage or not, right? So for philosophers, logicians, there's a certain definition for validity where only arguments are valid when they have certain relationships between premises and conclusions. And we also have an ordinary use of valid, right? So that's a kind of coded speech, but also sort of jargony terms that don't really have any use outside of their technical application, and which would therefore sound just like a word that means nothing to me, the outsider, right? I think generational slang is also very much coded speech, right? Those of us in the older generations are quite intentionally left out of the loop. So in the examples I've been giving so far, I've been including both what I call overtly coded speech and covertly coded speech, where the difference is that message which only some audience members receive, the ones who are proficient with some additional practice. If those of us who are left out of the loop recognize that there's some additional message being sent to someone else, or just some other message being sent to someone else, then that's an instance of overtly coded speech. The fact that it's coded isn't hidden from us, right? So when philosophers use supererogatory, a word I think does not have current usage in English, right? If I hear that and I'm not familiar with the technical use, I recognize that. I recognize that the speaker is saying something, is sending some message to those who do know, and not to me. And I'm not, well, fooled is putting it a bit too intentionally, right? But I'm not mistakenly thinking that the speaker has communicated something to me as well as to the same message to others. But when philosophers are using valid, at least in certain contexts where it might be ambiguous between the technical use, the ordinary use, there, if I'm not familiar with the technical use, then I might not catch the fact that other hearers are receiving a different message than mine, right? And so someone says, yes, this argument is valid, I think they mean it is a reasonable claim to make, sufficiently plausible, compelling, etc. Whereas those who are familiar with this narrower technical usage think, ah, yes, if these premises are true, then this conclusion must also be true. So covertly coded speech then does not have to be harmful, derogatory, definitely doesn't have to be racist, needn't be malicious. Things like in jokes, or at least in jokes that are crafted in a particularly careful way, are certainly covertly coded speech, in that the person who's not in on the joke will often not realize that there's a joke. Certain expression or turns of phrase that are only used by members of particular communities based on their activities or their interests, especially often sort of communities or activities or practices that are socially or politically or legally or morally unacceptable to the broader community, right? So among, say, recreational drug users, there's a whole lot of language which often is not just coded, but covertly coded, right? Using the term horse to refer to heroin in at least some context, depending on the sentence in which the term appears, right, will not raise any red flags for those who are out of the loop. So dog whistles, I think, are a kind of covertly coded speech, at least until we get our hands on those dog whistles and start informing one another that they are dog whistles. But at the point at which they really are functioning as dog whistles and only some hearers get that hidden coded message, the hearers that aren't getting, say, the racist message sent by something like states' rights, are also not recognizing that there is some other message being sent to some other audience members. They think, oh, yes, we're talking about the 10th Amendment and the, federal system and distribution of powers between the federal government and the individual states and so forth. I think where dog whistles differ from the various other kinds of covertly coded speech I've been describing is then clearly in first the sort of norm violating aspect of the messages sent by dog whistles, right? All of the terms or phrases that are typically identified as dog whistles are racist, Islamophobic, sexist. They're the sorts of messages that were a speaker to say the same thing flat out explicitly, they would be censured by our community broadly. But I do think that it's a bit less clear how exactly then dog whistles differ from, say, using horse to refer to heroin, which also in many contexts, referring to it explicitly would be censurable. I think for dog whistles, there's also this political element, which is a bit more difficult to capture in a succinct definition.
Yeah, when I was reading your descriptions of them, a couple of things came to mind, and one of the ones was, the Gamergate code, ethics in gaming journalism became shorthand for this whole misogynistic kind of men's rights movement within a certain segment of the internet. And then you used the term in the paper, welfare versus social security or social welfare. And let's talk about some of the heavy lifting these terms do in that context, because I think what you're describing is pretty understandable, but why is it done? And I think that's the bigger question to the kind of the political context, I think. Like if you're going to signal to a group of people a racist context, understandably, I guess you can't do that. But what about these other terms that kind of like welfare and social security? What is the difference between those two terms and how do they interact? And what is one doing while the other is doing something different?
Yeah, so I think why are some of these terms used is definitely the central question. I think many answers have been offered. Which is the best explanation is going to depend on the particular term we're looking at. And even then, it seems multiple explanations are equally plausible and equally well supported by the kinds of social science data that we currently have available. So, in the case of welfare and social security, one compelling explanation of some of the measured effects is that the difference in name changes the framing of the issue that's being discussed, right? So although the terms are synonymous in the sense that they're referring or ought to be referring to the same sets of policies and programs, the sorts of considerations that the different choice in terms rules in and rules out as relevant or irrelevant seems to explain the rather stark differences in attitudes that people report. So if you survey Americans today, 20 years ago, 40 years ago, you find that the vast majority of people support increased funding for Social Security and do not support increased funding for, quote, welfare. Even more starkly, right, if you ask people whether they support increasing funding for federal assistance programs for the poor, something like 3/4 of Americans in a survey from about 10 years ago, 70 something percent of Americans say they support federal assistance programs, but not welfare. And now it seems that this is not a random quirk of the people being surveyed, right? But rather that the way welfare has been used in the past in many by many politicians, but also in certain forms of media coverage, right? All of the stories of quote unquote welfare queens in the Reagan era sort of framed that as a wasteful expenditure on the federal government's part. And those kinds of framings, those associations seem to stick around, even for folks who may not firsthand have witnessed those older uses of the term welfare. On the other hand, for other turns of phrase, states' rights possibly, law and order perhaps as well, it seems that a difference in framing isn't quite enough to explain all of the different considerations and values and priorities and preferences that become relevant when a speaker uses a phrase like law and order. It seems sort of one of the key functions I've thus far left out of the account is the way that language serves to define group membership and or not necessarily remind us as if we've forgotten, but make it a salient feature of our interpretive context, right? So the kinds of reaffirmations of our shared in-group identity for those of us who are in the in-group and the othering of those who are in the out-group. And there it seems like it wouldn't quite be so important if the hidden coded message really were hidden from the out-group in order to serve this kind of in-grouping, out-grouping functions. But again, this will vary depending on what phrase we're looking at and at what point in time and what's the community that we're considering.
Yeah, one of the things that you deal a lot with in the paper, and I was very interested in this, is a practice-focused approach to understanding how these terms kind of reproduce or continue to maintain a meaning, even when, as you said, you may be very historically distanced from its original meaning or its original racist connotation. So, like states' rights goes back to the Civil War, and it just is constantly continued to be readapted. So, without necessarily hiding the fact that it goes back to Civil War. But when you bring it up again, people can plausibly deny, oh, that's not what I'm talking about. That term is antiquated, that's an anachronism, but not really, because it's still coded in that term. And I mean, it gets incredibly complicated, but also really fascinating how we kind of build upon language within groups and allow new members to come in based on while pushing others out and the whole thing. So maybe you could talk about the practice-focused approach that you use in the paper, and also how these terms, fit into that within that reproduction.
Yeah, so I think one of the reasons to study dog whistle speech, other political uses of language more generally, in addition to the moral considerations, the political upshots, which are of clear value, these uses of language also tell us something really insightful and important about language more generally. And it's something that, at least in the philosophy of language that's been the dominant trend in the US since about the 1940s and 50s, we've not paid a lot of attention to that kind of cross-temporal historical influence of past speakers' uses and the ways in which they constrain the uses to which we can put the same language today, and also enable us to make sense of one another's words, right? Because the fact that it's our familiarity with certain practices that makes it possible for us to understand one another is just a general feature of what it is to communicate, whether that's using natural languages like English, Spanish, Mandarin, but also how we understand things like gestures, facial expressions, body language, right? All of those too stem from our familiarities with certain shared practices, which on the one hand extend across time, across different contexts, but are also not simply universal, right? So if you travel to Eastern Europe, you'll find people are not smiling all the time at strangers as you pass by them on the street. And it's very difficult as an American to not interpret that as rudeness or anger, whereas in fact, it does not send that message to anyone embedded in the local practices, right? The norms simply differ. And this is something we're perfectly well familiar with. The same goes with the ways we use language, which we're relying not only on our proficiency in various linguistic practices, how is a certain word used, how do we construct sentences, well-formed sentences, but also the kinds of social, geographic, class, field, right? Like people from the medical field will use words with Latin origins much more frequently, even when it comes to words that have nothing to do with naming parts of bodies or diseases or anything like that, right? And we'll often pick up on those trends in one another's speech sort of fully automatically, quickly, unconsciously under the radar, because that's part of our proficiency as social beings in kind of recognizing in one another, oh, where is this person from based on how they sound? What are some of their interests and values and what do they not care about, and how are they framing the questions that we might be discussing. All of that is also a feature of our proficiency and familiarity with various kinds of social practices and social norms that go beyond the ones that are strictly sort of typically conceived as linguistic practices.
Yeah, that's interesting because I think that puts into context some of what we're talking about, because then within those practices, there are performances of that pre-exist in order to give our social interactions meaning, but also start to attach themselves to the language we use, not only within the in-group of like, friend forming, if you all like video games, you have a way of talking about those video games that may sound foreign to someone else, but then when it starts getting bigger and bigger, it becomes a political endeavor that starts taking on a performative value that kind of we're talking about at the beginning, like what is Trump doing? And that's one of those things that I'd love for you to hit again, is how these coded messages perform in the context of those groups, where they succeed, how they fail, when they're reproduced again, how they are. Because in the paper you talk a lot about how you can use these coded words without knowing the meaning, and thus extending the code word. So if I use welfare in a sentence, I'm actually extending the coded message of potential racism or classism or sexism, whatever it is that is out there, without intending to do so, correct?
Yeah, and I think this is yet another place where thinking about the um, puzzle in terms of practices and not just in terms of individual bits of speech is very helpful. So a practice just is made up of all of the individual performances of that practice, right? All of the actions that sort of count as or are treated as by audiences being instances of that same shared practice. The focus on kind of the intention and often the malicious intention, I think, when we're looking at dog whistles, is often quite unproductive in several ways. First, intentions are unfortunately really only known by the person that has them. And that sort of privileged access makes it effectively impossible to ever prove or disprove one way or the other who had a certain intention or didn't have a certain intention in saying what they said. Speakers might be fully, sincerely unaware and be unable to prove that sincerity. And vice versa, speakers might perfectly well have intended to exploit our often implicit biases and have the room to deny because there is this more widespread ordinary usage of the same word or phrase, which does not convey that message. And so we're not really making any progress on the kinds of moral questions about should we hold someone responsible for having made racist stereotypes or attitudes salient in our discussion of what federal programs should we fund or not fund. Whom do we hold responsible and when? We get on this impossible sort of tangent about were they intending this or not, where no one can prove anything and we're stuck. So pragmatically, that's not very helpful. On the theoretical side too, though, we're not really making any progress in understanding what it takes, what's required, and what's made possible by speakers using say, dog whistles. If we're trying to locate sort of just all of the uses that were really intentionally exploiting some of our racist implicit attitudes, well, again, we can't even begin doing the research because we can't yet identify who really had those intentions, right? And so it seems like we'll need to look somewhere else. And looking at the effects of the speech is a good starting point, I think. But here we must be careful to distinguish the kinds of effects that a bit of speech has on a particular audience in that particular context as a result of something unique to that context or unique to that audience, versus the kinds of effects that the same bit of speech has on this audience in this context, and also would have had on other audiences in other contexts at different times, at different places, by other speakers, within conversations or speeches, which share some features of context but differ in others, right? The effects that recur reliably, sort of systematically across those contexts, I think those are the effects that are much more productive and lead to some more insights about how this kind of language works and what it takes to use it and what it takes to attempt to resist it or improve it. And so the notion of practice is just a way to frame the relevant kinds of effects, the ones that recur systematically, and to connect those effects to what I think is, in fact, their cause, ultimately, our familiarity with other people having talked the same way, more or less, in similar sorts of situations, right? So, as I understand it, to perform practice has only fairly minimal requirements on the speaker's or practitioner's part. I can perform all sorts of practices unintentionally. Some practices are very unique and I can't perform them unintentionally, right? So the practice of pronouncing two people as married, if I'm an ordained minister, but I'm talking in my sleep and saying this as part of our practice of officiating weddings, right? That's just ruled out as a potential performance. But many of our ordinary speech practices don't have quite such a high standard of intentionality on the speaker's part, right? Quite ordinarily, when speakers use a slur or say something offensive or insulting, we hold them responsible, at least in some attenuated sense, even when they are in fact unaware or it was unintentional, right? We correct young children if for some reason they pick up not just slurs and sort of derogatory epithets, but offensive language too. And we do the same for, say, language learners, right? Someone that as an adult is learning English as a second language, third language, etc., we'll also correct them. And in at least some cases, not hold them responsible might sound a bit punitive, but they will be accountable for the offense or insult that they caused. At the very least, we'll expect an apology, minimally a performative apology, if not a very sincere one, right? So it's, I think, not very strange, and it's definitely not unique to dog whistle speech, to hold speakers responsible for harmful effects of their speech, even when they didn't intend it. And the fact that we often hold speakers responsible for things like racist slurs or insults that directly sort of impact someone right there suggests that the more harmful and the more important the effects of their speech, the less it takes on the side of intention for a speaker to count as having participated in that practice of slurring or derogating or insulting or offending. And here it seems that what we do is we take more seriously the ways that audiences are recognizing what the speaker is doing as part of this shared practice and taking that to be the justifying reason for holding that speaker responsible, at least to some attenuated degree.
Yeah, and I think this is where the kind of the rubber hits the road, because we're talking two levels of responsibility, right? Because there's the interpersonal, and that if I said a slur to somebody, that's a different performance than if I'm a political speaker speaking in front of a rally. And how do we hold that, like the microaggression conversation is one that's being had all over about the interpersonal. But I think that the larger political context of, even if we know this is a dog whistle, even if we know this is covertly coded speech, how does the system, as it were, hold that political speech accountable, especially when there's a group of insiders who thrill at being included in the larger discussion? So you understand where I'm going with that? Because it seems like there's a group of white supremacists out there who are constantly throwing coded speech into the discourse. It gets swept up and picked up, and there's no accountability for the speakers who are using it at a national level. There would be accountability at an interpersonal level, is what I'm trying to say, between two people, but there isn't at this cultural level. So where's the mechanism? What are the avenues to hold that cultural discourse accountable?
This is one of the frustrating features of the kind of deniability that speakers get when they use covertly coded speech or dog whistles. Very commonly described as plausible deniability. And I remember shortly after I started thinking about dog whistles, I was speaking to one of my dissertation advisors, and he said, "How is this plausible deniability? It's completely implausible. Everybody knows what states' rights is really talking about. States' rights is so old and tired. Law and order is so old and tired. Nobody genuinely doesn't know something about the history. Nobody doesn't know that welfare was tied to race in this way, right?" And the frustrating thing is, rhetorically, nevertheless, speakers do maintain some room to deny. And here, there's some options for how to continue that sentence. They have some room to deny sending the coded derogatory, in this case, racist message. They have also room to deny sending it intentionally. And then they have room to deny something like being part of that whole practice, sort of, I'm denying that I'm using law and order in the way Nixon used law and order. I'm just using it to talk about law and order, just that. And unfortunately, I think this is just an inevitable feature of the nature of this kind of language. So long as there continues to exist, to some extent, a practice of using the word law, a practice of using the word order, and a practice of combining two English words with the word and between them to refer to the conjunct of the two, there's just no way to get away from that as a rhetorical move. Now, that's still not getting at your question, which was not about the sort of merely performative, merely rhetorical denial. But now on the side of actually holding speakers accountable, actually treating them as responsible, here I think is a question that a theorist of language is not the best person to identify the tools, right? So on the side of language, here's what I can at least say. Hearers, as we've seen, do in fact have quite a bit of say in determining what kind of speech someone in fact issued or performed. if I take someone as having made a promise or having apologized, that often is enough to make it the case that they have promised, they have apologized. And if they were a bit unclear, we're going to at least both need to apologize to one another and sort things out, right? So there's actually, I think we have, as audiences, a bit more power than we often think, or more power than is often accentuated in the discussions around dog whistles. If you dig your heels in and really take seriously that this speaker who keeps talking about welfare is just talking about the following set of racist stereotypes, and continue the conversation sort of on those assumptions, that is in fact changing within the context in which you and they are both operating, what practice they count as having participated in. Now, the additional element that makes it now harder at the political level is that there's a whole lot of other hearers, right? And whether sincerely or not, if they maintain that, no, this speaker is talking about welfare or states' rights is just about the policy issues, now we're again at a bit of an impasse. But yet again, this impasse is not unique to dog whistles, to covertly coded speech, or to harmful speech, right? We quite often have different subsets of linguistic communities that will use different terms, different grammatical structures differently, that might pronounce things differently, right? And within even quite small, say, regional, geographically delimited communities, there'll still be differences and disagreements among different speakers about what something means, whether something is the right way to say something, spell something, pronounce something, etc. So that's something we constantly confront in speaking to one another. And how do we ordinarily deal with it there? There's no global answer. It will depend in each case on the relationships between speakers and hearers, right? As you're pointing out, are they intimate friends? Are they co-workers? Or are they complete strangers? Are they complete strangers meeting in a public square? Are they complete strangers meeting in, say, a transactional kind of environment, the cashier at the store and the customer set of norms? So it will depend on their relationship, the context of their discourse, and the kinds of norms, values, and expectations that conventionally govern those sorts of interactions. In the case of politicians making, say, a State of the Union address, I think there are certain liberal political norms that we can point to, which should endorse a sort of higher standard of accountability for public officials, right? Insofar as they are influential figures, reason number one. Another reason, insofar as they, at least per the liberal ideals, merely our representatives and ought to be pursuing the things that their voters have at least implicitly endorsed in supporting their election. We might derive sort of similar norms for transparency in their speech from those ideals of a representative, democratic, liberal form of government. I think, again, there's a deeper sense in which this doesn't fully sort of satisfyingly answer your questions, though, right? Because what I'm pointing to are ideals that we are well familiar with and we cite, and that is not in and of itself always enough to realize the ideal in practice in a particular situation.
Yeah, and I think that's just a frustrating reality of the culture we live in and the language we speak, no matter what the flavor of it. As you said, we could maybe speaking Mandarin and have the same conversation about a Mandarin turn of phrase that would be just as offensively coded as what's in English. But I think it's kind of a universal quandary or problem. So, how would you wrap this up? If you're going to give an elevator speech about the whole process of this coded, uncoded, dog whistle, covertly coded, in like 2 or 3 sentences, how would you wrap up this conversation?
I suppose I would say that however pessimistic we might be about the prospects of really, with our responsibility and accountability practices, changing how public officials are speaking, we might be quite pessimistic about that, in fact, leading to the change we'd like to see. Despite that, however, across the history of human languages, the English language, with which I'm most familiar at least, we've seen communities of speakers do quite radical things with words. So, on the one hand, we might feel quite hopeless about the ways that the history of usage is seemingly locking us into this practice, right? States' rights being used to justify in different forms racist and oppressive practices, as you pointed out, from the Civil War era up to today, might make us think there's just no way out. It just will forever be helpless, sort of powerless over our practices. And yet, that is not the case. So, for instance, we've seen speakers reclaim slurs, right? Most notably, within just the past, I suppose, 20 or 30 years, right? Queer really has become a very ordinary, neutral, positive label used by people, not just to identify themselves as queer, but also to speak with no derogation about others. And that suggests that actually we do have some room to quite radically revise our practices. And the case of slur reclamation is one example, but other kinds of meaning change suggests that really it just takes people's doing it. If practices just are made up of the individual performances of those practices, then how do you change a practice? How do you abolish a practice? How do you bring up a new practice? It's just a bunch of people doing things in similar ways, typically with a concerted effort, right? So to the extent that we do continue drawing attention to the history of the usage of phrases like states' rights or law and order, right? And that we sort of keep insistently in response identifying those uses as part of that practice and not any other, not any neutral one, that is a way of working on the practice and hopefully slowly making it increasingly impossible or unavailable for speakers to insist that, no, there is this other one also where it's neutral and it's not racist, and that's the one I'm really invoking.